Man wins lottery and abandons his wife and son. The next day he discovers the ticket is fake. Richard Mitchell held the lottery ticket with trembling hands, the numbers dancing before his eyes as he checked them for the 10th time. $65 million. His heart pounded so hard it hurt his chest. "Margaret, look at this," he shouted to his wife, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "I won! I won the lottery!" Margaret appeared in the living room doorway, drying her hands on her apron, with 4-year-old Michael clinging to her leg. The boy had the same brown eyes as his father and a smile that always melted anyone's heart. "What are you talking about, Richard?" asked Margaret, in a tone that suggested she was used to her husband's grand dreams. $65 million, Margaret. $65 million. Richard danced around the room, waving the ticket in the air. No more struggling. No more this old house, this old car, this life of living paycheck to paycheck. Richard was 52 and worked as a sales representative for a small cleaning products company in Chicago. Married to Margaret for 20 years, he had always dreamed of the big stroke of luck that would change their lives. He was a man of intense personality, an extreme dreamer with a dangerous tendency to make impulsive decisions when he got excited about something. Margaret approached slowly, still skeptical. She knew her husband too well to realize he could easily delude himself. "Let me see that ticket," she said, reaching out. "No." Richard pulled the paper to his chest. "You'll jinx it. Every time you touch my things, it brings bad luck." That accusation stung Margaret like a knife. She had always been the family's anchor, the one who kept her feet on the ground while Richard floated in the clouds. She was a 45-year-old woman with brown hair always tied in a simple ponytail, working as an administrative assistant at a public school to help with household expenses. "What do you mean I bring bad luck?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Richard, are you sure you read the numbers right?" "Of course I am," he snapped. "Do you think I'm stupid? Look here." Richard placed the ticket on the coffee table in their small living room and turned on the TV. The lottery draw was replaying the previous day's results. As the numbers were announced, Richard's grin grew even wider. "See? See?" he shouted with each matching number. 17, 23, 31, 42, 56, 61. All the same, all the same. Margaret looked at the ticket and then at the TV. The numbers did seem to match, but something deep in her heart felt off. Maybe it was just the fear that this happiness was too good to be true. "Mom, why is Daddy shouting?" asked Michael, gripping his mother's leg tighter. "Daddy's happy, sweetheart," Margaret replied, stroking her son's blonde hair. "Very happy." But Richard wasn't just happy. He was in a euphoria Margaret had never seen before. He paced back and forth, talking to himself, planning aloud everything he'd do with the money. "First thing, I'll buy a mansion in Beverly Hills. No, even better, a beach house in Malibu. No, wait, even better, a beach house and a mansion in the city. Money won't be an issue." Margaret felt a growing knot in her stomach. She knew Richard so well that she could tell when he was slipping into one of his dangerous fantasy states. It was the same look he had when he invested all their savings in that pyramid scheme that left them in debt for 2 years. "Richard, calm down. Let's first go to the lottery office tomorrow and confirm—" "Confirm what?" he interrupted, sharply. "You think I can't check numbers? You think I'm incapable of anything?" The aggressive tone made Margaret take a step back. Richard had never spoken to her like that before. Michael began to cry softly, frightened by his father's raised voice. "That's not it, honey. It's just that you never believe me," Richard exploded. "Never! Always doubting, always putting obstacles in everything. That's why we never get anywhere." The words felt like slaps. Margaret felt tears welling up, but didn't want to cry in front of their son. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night, Richard barely slept. He stayed awake until 3 a.m., crunching numbers, planning investments, imagining the new life that would begin the next day. Margaret pretended to sleep, but spent the whole night listening to her husband's excited whispers, feeling a growing ache in her chest. The next morning, Richard woke before 6. He showered, dressed in his best grey suit, the one he wore, for special occasions and combed his hair more carefully than usual. At 52, he was still a handsome man, with greying temples that gave him a distinguished air. "Where are you going so early?" Margaret asked, still in bed. "I'm going to the lottery office to confirm the prize, then to the bank. Had to sort everything out," he replied, checking the ticket for the 1,000th time. "Then I need to stop by the real estate agency to look at some houses." "Richard, wouldn't it be better if we went together?" "Why? So you can doubt everything and get in the way," he answered without even looking at her. "I can handle this alone." Michael was still asleep in the next room when Richard left the house. He didn't say goodbye to his wife, didn't give his usual morning kiss. He just slammed the door behind him, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The lottery office was 3 blocks from their home in Riverdale. It was a lower middle-class neighborhood, with small houses and narrow streets. Richard walked with long strides, greeting neighbors with a different smile, more confident, as if he were already someone else. "Mr. Oliver," he called as he entered the lottery office. "I need to check this ticket." Oliver had owned the lottery office for 15 years, a 60-year-old man, bald with a prominent belly that wobbled when he walked. He'd known Richard for a long time and was well aware of his obsession with games and bets. "Let me see here, Richard," Oliver said, taking the ticket and walking to the computer. "Wow, you seem different today. Excited." "That's because I won, Mr. Oliver. The jackpot." Oliver typed the numbers into the system and waited for the result to appear on the screen. Richard stood on the other side of the counter, drumming his fingers nervously on the glass surface. "That's strange," Oliver murmured, adjusting his glasses. "What's strange?" Richard asked, feeling the first knot in his stomach. "It says here this ticket isn't a winner." "What do you mean, not a winner?" Richard leaned over the counter. "Check it again." Oliver typed again, more slowly. The result was the same. "Richard, this ticket didn't win anything. The numbers don't match yesterday's draw." "That's impossible." Richard snatched the ticket from Oliver's hands. "I checked them on TV last night. Every number matched." "Let me take another look." Oliver took the ticket back and examined it closely. "Richard, are you sure this ticket is from yesterday's draw?" "Of course I'm sure. I bought it yesterday morning right here from you." Oliver went to a drawer and pulled out a folder with receipts. "Richard, look here, you bought a ticket yesterday, but it wasn't this one. This ticket here is from 2 days ago." "What do you mean from 2 days ago?" "Look at the date here." Oliver pointed to a small print in the corner of the ticket. "This one's from Tuesday's draw. Yesterday was Thursday." Richard felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. He took the ticket with trembling hands and examined the date. Sure enough, it was printed there, Tuesday. But how was that possible? "I don't understand," he stammered. "I'm sure I bought this ticket yesterday." "Richard, you were a bit distracted when you came in yesterday. Remember you were on the phone? Maybe you grabbed an old ticket from your wallet." The memory slowly came back to him. Richard remembered he had indeed been on a call with a client when he entered the lottery booth. He remembered having some old tickets in his wallet. He remembered rushing out because he was late for a meeting. But the numbers... "I checked the numbers on TV." "Which TV did you watch?" Oliver asked. On the channel," Richard tried to recall. "It was a rerun of the draw." "Richard, you watched the rerun of Tuesday's draw that aired last night. That's why the numbers matched." The truth hit Richard like a bucket of ice water. He hadn't won anything. There was no 65 million, no new life, nothing but the same old reality. "But then, I didn't win anything?" "Unfortunately. Not, Richard, I'm sorry." Richard left the lottery booth like a zombie. He walked slowly down the street, still processing what had happened. How could he have been so foolish? How had he believed it so easily? And worst of all, how was he going to explain this to Margaret? When he got home, Margaret was in the kitchen making breakfast for Michael. The boy was sitting in his high chair, eating cereal and watching cartoons on his tablet. "So?" Margaret asked as soon as she saw him walk in. Richard couldn't look his wife in the eye. He stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, shoulders slumped, his expression devastated. "I didn't win anything," he murmured. "What do you mean?" "The ticket was from 2 days ago. I got confused. I watched the wrong rerun of the draw." Margaret, felt a mix of relief and pity for her husband. Relief because deep down she knew it was too good to be true, and pity because she saw the genuine pain in Richard's eyes. "Oh, my love," she said, stepping closer to hug him. "I'm so sorry." But Richard pulled away sharply. "I don't want anyone's pity," he said angrily. "Especially not yours." "Richard, why are you talking to me like this? Because you were hoping I hadn't won. I saw it on your face last night. You didn't want it to be true." The accusation was unfair and painful. Margaret had her doubts, but she would never root against her own family's happiness. "That's not true, and you know it." "Yes, it is. You're afraid I'll make something of myself. Afraid you won't be needed anymore." Michael stopped eating and stared at his parents with wide eyes. This argument was different from the others. There was something heavier in the air, something the boy didn't understand, but that scared him. "Daddy, why are you mad at Mommy?" he asked in a small voice. Richard looked at his son and felt a stab of guilt, but his wounded pride was stronger than anything. "Because sometimes the people we love the most don't believe in our dreams, Michael," he replied. "Sometimes the ones closest to us are the ones who doubt us the most." Margaret felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of unwavering support, and Richard was accusing her of not believing in him. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "How can you say I don't believe in you?" "Because it's true. You always bring me down. You always think I'll fail. You always look like you're at a funeral whenever I have." A new idea. "Do I look worried, Richard? Like a mother worried about her family, not wanting to see us struggling again." "Struggling?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You think we're struggling? We're barely making ends meet, Richard. Every month is a scramble to pay the bills. Michael needs new clothes and we don't have the money. The fridge has been making noise for 3 months and we can't replace it. And you think that's my fault? I didn't say it's your fault. I'm saying we need to be realistic." "Realistic?" Richard repeated the word like it was a curse. "That's your favorite word, isn't it? Realistic, pragmatic, down to earth, all those things that kill people's dreams." Margaret couldn't take it anymore. Tears began streaming down her face as she tried to keep her composure in front of their son. "I'm taking Michael to school," she said, grabbing the boy's lunchbox. "Come on, sweetheart." "Mommy's crying," Michael asked, concerned. "Mommy's fine, honey, let's go." After Margaret and Michael left, Richard stood alone in the silent kitchen. He looked around the small house, with its old furniture and walls in need of paint. All the frustration of his life, the mediocrity he'd carried for years, came rushing back. It wasn't just about the lottery ticket, it was about everything. It was about working at a small company selling cleaning supplies. It was about driving a 15-year-old car. It was about renting a house in Riverdale. It was about never being able to give his family the life he'd dreamed of. At 52, Richard felt like a failure. And the worst part was that Margaret knew it. She never said it, but he saw it in her eyes. He saw it when she sighed before opening the bills. He saw it when she glanced at the displays in expensive stores. He saw it when she compared their life to their friends. The phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. "Hello? Richard, it's Mark from the office. Where are you?" "We had a 9 o'clock meeting with the distributors team." Richard checked the clock. It was 10:15 a.m. He'd completely lost track of time. "Mark, I'd had a problem at home. Can we reschedule?" "Man, this was an important meeting. The distributors team came all the way from San Diego just for this. They're pretty upset." "I'm sorry, I really can't make it right now." "Richard, are you okay? You sound off." "I'm fine, just need to sort some things out here." "All right, but we'll have to talk about this later." Richard hung up and collapsed onto the living room couch. It felt like his whole life was crumbling at once. His job, his marriage, his self-esteem, everything seemed to be slipping away. Then the doorbell rang. Richard opened the door to find a well-dressed man in his 40s holding an executive briefcase. "Are you Richard Mitchell?" "Yes, that's me." "My name is Charles Foster. I'm a financial consultant." "May I come in? I have a proposal that might interest you." Normally, Richard would be suspicious of any salesman showing up at his door. But right now, depressed and desperate, Any distraction was welcome. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Charles entered the living room and glanced around with a professional smile. "Cozy place," he remarked, though it was obvious he was just being polite. "Thanks. What did you want to talk to me about?" "Well, Mr. Mitchell, I work with alternative investments, opportunities for people who want to step out of their comfort zone and multiply their wealth quickly." Richard straightened up on the couch. After the morning's disappointment, any talk of money caught his attention. "What kind of investment?" "I work with a group of investors who fund emerging businesses, startups, franchises, imports. The returns are fast and the profits are very high." "How much return?" "It depends on the amount invested, but generally we can triple the investment in 6 months." Richard felt his heart race again. Triple in 6 months. That meant if he invested $10,000, he'd have $30,000 in half a year. "And what's the minimum investment?" $15,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's the minimum to join the group. Richard did the math in his head. He didn't have $15,000 in his checking account, but he had the employment savings fund. He also had some money from his previous job's severance sitting in savings, and he had his car, worth about 20 grand. "How exactly does it work?" Charles opened his briefcase and showed some papers with charts and projections. "Look here at the results of our recent investors. This one invested 20,000 and withdrew 60 in 8 months. This lady here invested 10 and has already withdrawn 25. The numbers danced before Richard's eyes like a desert mirage. After so many years of a mediocre life, here was a real chance for change. "I need to think about it." "Of course, Mr. Mitchell, but I must be honest with you. We only have 2 spots left in this group. If you take too long to decide, you might miss out." "Only 2 spots?" "Yes. And listen, I'll be frank with you. I came here because I have a good feeling about you. Your profile, your potential. I think you'd make a great investor." Richard felt flattered. Finally, someone saw potential in him. Finally, someone believed he could be more than just a mediocre cleaning supplies salesman. "When do I need to give my answer?" "The group meets tomorrow afternoon to close this round of investments. If you want in, I'll need your answer by noon tomorrow." After Charles left, Richard paced around the house thinking about the offer. $15,000 to turn into $45,000 in 6 months. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd always looked for. When Margaret came back from school with Michael, she found Richard worked up again, but in a different way than that morning. "Margaret, an amazing opportunity came up today." "What opportunity?" she asked, already suspicious. "A financial consultant came by. They have an investor group that multiplies money in just a few months." Margaret's stomach sank again. She recognized that tone in her husband's voice. It was the same as when he'd discovered that pyramid scheme. "Richard, this doesn't sound right. Why does everything that could work out for me never sound right to you?" "Because money doesn't multiply quickly without risk, Richard. If it were that easy, everyone would be rich. Not everyone has the guts to invest. Everyone else just settles for their same mediocre life." Michael was playing with his toy cars on the living room floor, but was listening to his parents' conversation. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the tension in the air. "How much money are you thinking of investing?" Margaret asked, trying to stay calm. $15,000. $15,000? Richard, we don't have $15,000. I have the employment savings fund. I have savings, and if I need to, I can sell the car. Have you lost your mind? Sell the car? How will you work without a car? Just for a little while. In 6 months, I'll buy a better car with the investment profits. Margaret sat on the couch and buried her face in her hands. She felt like she was living a nightmare. First, the lottery. Fantasy. Now this miracle investment story. Richard, please listen to me. These quick money schemes are always scams, always. Did you see the papers he brought? Did you see the other investors' results? Anyone can fake papers, Richard. Anyone can make up stories. So you think I'm stupid? You think just anyone can fool me? I think you're desperate. And when we're desperate, we don't think straight. The word desperate hit Richard like a slap in the face. It was true, but it hurt to hear it from his own wife. I'm not desperate. I'm trying to improve our life. Our life doesn't need improving this way, Richard. We're fine. We have our health, we have jobs, we have a close family. Jobs? Richard laughed bitterly. A job selling detergent to dive bars? You call that having a job? It's honest work that puts food on the table. Barely. Scraps, Margaret. Scraps. And you're happy with that. I'm happy with having a happy family. Happy family, Richard repeated, sarcastic. Living paycheck to paycheck. No money to give Michael a better education. No money to travel. No money for anything. Michael is happy, Richard. He doesn't need anything more than our love. Richard looked at his son playing on the floor and felt a pang in his heart. Michael really did seem happy, oblivious to his parents' financial struggles. But Richard wanted more for him. He wanted to give his son the opportunities he'd never had. I want him to have more than this, Richard said, quieter. I want him to go to private school, take English lessons, have the same chances as rich kids. And he will, Richard. With time, with work, with planning. Time. Richard flared up again. I'm 52, Margaret. How much time do you think I have left? The words hung heavy between them. Margaret knew Richard felt pressured by his age, as if time was slipping away without him achieving anything. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now back to the story. That night, dinner was silent. Michael tried to talk about his day at school, but his parents were clearly distracted. Richard ate mechanically, lost in thoughts about the investment offer. Margaret pushed food around her plate, worried about what her husband might do. After putting Michael to bed, they returned to the living room, and the tension erupted again. I'm going to invest, Richard said bluntly. Richard, please, I've made up my mind. I'll withdraw the employment savings fund tomorrow morning and make the investment. And if it goes wrong, what if it's a scam? It won't. How can you be so sure? Because I need to believe in something, Margaret. I need to believe there's a way out of this life. What life? Margaret stood up from the couch, upset. What life do you hate so much? Life with me? Life with Michael? That's not it. It is. You talk about our life like it's a prison, like Michael and I are weighing you down. You're not a burden, Richard said, but without conviction. Then why do you talk like that? Why is everything in our life never enough for you? Richard stayed silent. He didn't know how to explain to Margaret that it wasn't about her or Michael. It was about himself. It was about that constant feeling of inadequacy, of mediocrity, of always falling behind while others thrived. I just want more, he finally said. More what? More everything, more money, more recognition, more success. I want people to remember me when I die as someone who accomplished something. Margaret's heart ached. She finally understood what was happening to Richard. It wasn't about money, it was about self-worth. It was about the fear of reaching the end of his life without having done anything meaningful. Richard, she stepped closer and took his hands. You've already accomplished so much. You have a family who loves you. You've raised a wonderful son. You've worked honestly for 20 years. That's not enough. Why isn't it enough? Because when I was a kid, I dreamed of being someone important. I dreamed of having a company, being rich, making a difference in the world. And look where I am. You make a difference in our world, Richard. In my world and in Michael's. That's not enough, Margaret. I'm sorry, but it's not. The words hurt Margaret more than she ever imagined possible. 20 years of marriage, dedication, unconditional love, and her husband was saying it wasn't enough. Then what will be enough? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you need to be happy? I need to feel like I'm worth something. I need to feel like my life had purpose. And investing $15,000 we don't have in a risky business is going to give you purpose. It'll give me a chance to change everything. Margaret realized she wouldn't be able to convince her husband. Once Richard got an idea in his head, no argument could make him back down. What if it goes wrong? She asked one last time. It won't. But what if it does? Richard stayed silent for a long moment. If it goes wrong, we'll figure it out, like we always do. We'll figure it out, Margaret repeated bitterly. It's always we, isn't it, Richard? When things go right, it's your brilliant idea. When they go wrong, it's we who figure it out. It's exactly that, and I'm tired, Richard. Tired of always being the safety net for your impossible dreams. Margaret left the room and went to the bedroom. Richard stayed alone but didn't feel guilty. He felt misunderstood. Why couldn't his wife see he was trying to improve their family's life? The next morning, Richard woke up determined. No matter what Margaret thought, he was going to make that investment. It was his chance to prove to himself and everyone else that he was still capable of great things. While Margaret took Michael to school, Richard went to the Federal Savings Bank branch to withdraw his employment savings fund. Exactly $17,400 saved over the years. More than enough for the investment. The manager tried to dissuade him. "Mr. Mitchell, the employment savings fund is an emergency reserve. Are you sure you want to withdraw it all?" "I'm sure." "May I ask what you'll use the money for?" "An investment." The manager frowned. He'd seen too many people lose their savings in risky investments. "Mr. Mitchell, if it's an investment, we have some safer products here at the bank. Thank you. But I already know where I'm investing." After sorting out the bank paperwork, Richard called Charles. "Hello, Charles, it's Richard Mitchell. I've decided to invest." "Excellent, Mr. Mitchell. I knew you were a visionary. Where can we meet?" "How about Riverdale Mall, at the Food Court Cafe?" "Perfect. Is 1 in the afternoon okay?" "Yes, that works." Richard arrived at the mall 15 minutes early. He was nervous but excited. Finally, he was doing something to change his life. Charles arrived right on time, impeccably dressed with his professional smile. "Mr. Mitchell, how are you? Did you bring the money?" "I did," Richard said, showing an envelope with the cash. $15,000. "Perfect. Let me just fill out the investment contract." Charles took out some papers from his briefcase and started filling in Richard's details. Everything looked very professional and official. "All set," Charles said after a few minutes. "Just need your signature here and here." Richard signed without reading the papers carefully. He was confident he'd finally made the right decision in his life. "And now?" he asked, handing over the envelope. "Now you wait. Within 48 hours, you'll receive an email with login details to track your investment online. In 6 months, you can withdraw the multiplied amount." "And can I withdraw earlier if I need to?" "You can, but the returns are lower. It's better to leave it the whole time to get the full profit." After Charles left, Richard stayed at the mall, walking back and forth, feeling different. He felt like a businessman, like an investor. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone important. When he got home, Margaret hadn't returned from work yet. Richard took the opportunity to research investments and capital multiplication online. He wanted to understand better how the business he'd put his money into worked. That's when he started to get worried. Every website he visited warned about scams involving promises of quick money multiplication. They all talked about Ponzi schemes, financial pyramids, fraud. No, Richard thought. Charles was different. He was serious, professional. He had paperwork. He had results from other investors. But the doubt had been planted and began to grow like a weed in his mind. When Margaret got home from work, she found Richard worked up again, but in a different way. He seemed nervous, anxious. "Did you make the investment?" she asked, already knowing the answer from her husband's face. "I did." "How much?" $15,000. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. $15,000 was practically their entire family emergency fund. "And now?" "Now we wait." "Wait how long?" 6 months. "What if we need the money before then?" "I can withdraw it early, but the profit is smaller." Margaret nodded silently. There was no point arguing now. The money had already been invested. All they could do was hope it wasn't a scam, but deep down she knew it was. That night, Richard barely slept again. He kept browsing online, researching investments, trying to convince himself he'd made the right decision. The more he read, the more worried he became. The next morning, he decided to call Charles to clear up some doubts. "Hello, Charles. Mr. Mitchell, how are you?" "I'm fine, but I have some questions about the investment." "Of course, go ahead." "Well, I was researching online and saw there are a lot of scams involving promises of quick money multiplication." "Oh, Mr. Mitchell, Charles laughed. "You can't believe everything you read online. The internet is full of jealous people who don't want to see others succeed. But, Mr. Mitchell, you signed a contract with me. Everything is documented. You can relax. And when will I? Get the login to track the investment. You'll receive it by email by tomorrow." Richard felt a little reassured, but the doubt still lingered in his mind. The next day, no email arrived. He called Charles again. "Hello, Charles, I didn't get the email." "Ah, Mr. Mitchell, there was a system issue, but it's been resolved. You'll get it by tomorrow." The following day, still no email. When he called Charles, the phone was disconnected. Richard felt his blood run cold. He called 2, 3, 4 more times. Always the same message. "The number you dialed does not exist or is out of coverage area." That's when reality hit him like a truck. He'd been scammed. $15,000. The family's entire savings. Gone. Richard sat on the living room floor and buried his head in his hands. How could he have been so stupid? How had he fallen for such an obvious scam? When Margaret came home from work and saw her husband's state, she immediately knew what had happened. "It was a scam, wasn't it?" she asked, not sounding surprised. Richard couldn't answer. He just nodded, still unable to look at his wife. Margaret sat beside him on the floor. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't scold him. She just stayed there, silent, sharing the weight of that loss. "What are we going to do now?" Richard asked after a long silence. "We'll manage," replied Margaret, echoing the words he himself had said days before. Like always, but this time the words tasted bitter. Because now it wasn't about improving their lives anymore, it was about survival. In the days that followed, Richard tried everything to recover the money. He filed a police report, consulted. Lawyers tried to track down Charles. But as expected, the man had vanished without a trace. The worst part was the humiliation. Richard felt like the biggest fool in the world. How could a 52-year-old man fall for such a basic scam? The family's financial situation, already tight, became desperate. Without their emergency savings, any unexpected expense turned into a catastrophe, and the unexpected didn't take long to arrive. A week after the scam, Richard's car broke down. The engine had completely seized, and the repair would cost over $8,000. With no money, Richard was left without transportation to work. "I can drop you off in the morning and pick you up at night," offered Margaret. "And what about your job? You'll be late to school every day." "We'll figure it out." "We'll figure it out," Richard repeated bitterly. That phrase is becoming the motto of our lives. But the worst was yet to come. At the company where he worked, Richard's performance had been slipping for months. The missed meeting on the day of the lottery ticket fiasco was the final straw. "Richard, I need to talk to you," said Mark, his boss, on a Thursday morning. "Go ahead." "The company is going through a restructuring. Unfortunately, we'll have to let some employees go." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet again. "You're firing me." "It's not personal, Richard. It's a numbers issue. Your department hasn't met targets for 3 months. Mark, I've worked here for 8 years. I've always been dedicated, always on time." "I know, Richard, and that's why I'll do everything I can to make sure your severance is as favorable as possible. But the decision has already been made by the board." Richard left the office. Like a zombie. Unemployed, broke, without a car. At 52, he felt like his life was over. When he got home and told Margaret, she said nothing. She just collapsed onto the couch and started crying. Not tears of anger or blame, tears of exhaustion. Exhaustion from always being strong, always finding a way, always fixing the mess. "Margaret," Richard began. "Don't say anything, right?" "Now, Richard," she interrupted. "Please, just don't say anything." Michael came home from school and found his mother crying on the couch and his father standing frozen in the doorway with an expression he'd never seen before. "Mommy, why are you crying?" the boy asked, climbing onto the couch and hugging Margaret. "Mommy's just a little sad, sweetheart," she replied, trying to steady herself. "Why are you sad?" Margaret looked at Richard, waiting for him to explain. But Richard couldn't speak. He couldn't explain to his 4-year-old son that his father had thrown all the family's money away and lost his job on top of it. "Daddy lost his job," Margaret finally said. "Won't he get another one?" Michael asked with childlike innocence. "He will, sweetheart. Daddy will find another job." But they all knew it wouldn't be easy. At 52, unemployed in the middle of an economic crisis, Richard knew finding a new position would be incredibly hard. That night, after Michael fell asleep, Richard and Margaret had the toughest conversation of their 20 years of marriage. "We need to decide what we're going to do," Margaret said. "I'll look for a job, I'll knock on every door, take anything. And in the meantime, how will we pay rent, food, Michael's school? You have your job." "Richard, I make $1,200 a month. Rent alone is $800. Then we'll have to move somewhere cheaper." "Where to? The slums?" "If that's what it takes, yes." Margaret felt like she was talking to a stranger. The man she married would never have agreed to put their family in such a situation. "Richard, how did we get to this point?" "It was a miscalculation." "It was a series of miscalculations," Margaret snapped. "Years of you making impulsive decisions without thinking about the consequences. I was trying to improve our lives. You were feeding your ego, trying to prove you were more than you really are." The words hit Richard like a knife to the heart. More than you really are. The phrase echoed in his mind like a death sentence. "And what am I really, Margaret?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret realized she'd gone too far, but she was too tired to back down. "You're a 52-year-old man who's sold cleaning products his whole life and never accepted it." "Accepted mediocrity, you mean?" "Accepted reality. Accepted that not everyone will be rich and famous. That there's dignity in honest work, even if it's not your dream job. You want me to give up on my dreams. I want you to stop destroying our family over impossible dreams." The word impossible stung more than Margaret realized. Richard stood from the couch and walked to the living room window, staring into the dark street. "Maybe you're right," he finally said. "Maybe my dreams are impossible." "Richard, maybe I am exactly what you said, a mediocre man who never accepted his own mediocrity." Margaret's heart ached. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to break her husband, just to bring him back to his senses, to the responsible man she'd fallen for. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Richard turned to face her. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I've never been able to give you and Michael the life you deserve. We never asked for luxury, Richard, just stability. And I couldn't even give you that." The silence that followed was heavy with years of resentment. Margaret watched her husband crumbling before her eyes and didn't know how to comfort him. Richard felt like a complete failure, with no way to rebuild their lives. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. The next week, Richard began job hunting with desperate determination. He woke at 6, showered, dressed in his grey suit and went out to hand out resumes, attend interviews, and knock on doors. But the job market for middle-aged men was brutal. Every company gave the same response: "Thank you, we'll be in touch." They never were. When he did land an interview, there was always someone younger, more energetic, willing to work for less. At 52, Richard realized he was too old for some and too inexperienced for others. After 2 weeks of rejections, his self-esteem hit rock bottom. He came home exhausted and defeated, too drained to even play with Michael. "Daddy sad?" the boy asked one night, climbing onto his lap. "Daddy's just tired, son." "Why don't you work anymore?" The innocent question felt like a punch to the gut. How could he explain to a 4-year-old that his father had lost his job because of foolish choices? "Dad is looking for a new job," replied Richard, hugging his son tightly. "And when will you find one?" "Soon, son. Soon." But Richard wasn't sure of anything. With each passing day, he felt older, more inadequate, more disposable. That's when things got even worse. Margaret came home on a Friday with a grim expression. "What happened?" Richard asked as soon as he saw her. "The school is cutting staff. They're letting all the administrative assistants go." "What do you mean?" "Budget crisis at the city. They're slashing costs across the board." Richard felt like the world was collapsing all over again. Now not only was he unemployed, but Margaret might lose her job too. When will this happen? By the end of the month, 2 weeks left, 2 weeks to find a solution, or the family would have no income at all. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stared at the dark ceiling, running numbers in his head. With no income, they wouldn't make next month's rent. Without rent money, they'd have to leave their home. And where would they go with a 4-year-old? The pressure was so intense that Richard started having anxiety attacks. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, drenched in cold sweat, feeling like he was suffocating. Margaret tried to calm him down, but she was on the verge of a breakdown herself. "Richard, we'll figure it out," she said, rubbing his back during one of his episodes. "We always do." "This time is different, Margaret. This time we're really screwed." "Don't talk like that in front of Michael." "Michael will have to learn someday that his father is a failure." "You're not a failure." "Yes, I am. And you know it. You always have." Margaret didn't know what else to say. Part of her was furious at her husband's irresponsible choices. But she also saw a man crumbling inside and couldn't help but pity him. The first week of March arrived, and Richard still hadn't found a job. Margaret got the official notice that she'd be let go by the end of the week. The rent was due on the 15th, and they had no money to pay it. That's when Richard made a desperate decision. "I'm selling the car," he announced one morning. "Richard, the car doesn't even run. I'll sell it for scrap. Should get us about $3,000. And then what? How will you look for work without a car? I'll take the bus, walk, hitch a ride, doesn't matter. The important thing is getting rent money this month." Margaret knew selling the car was just a temporary fix. $3,000 would cover March's rent. But what about April, May, the rest of their expenses? But she said nothing. She let Richard sell the car because there was no other choice. Some money was better than none. With the money from the car, they paid March's rent and bought 2 weeks' worth of groceries. But the situation was still desperate. They had no income in sight for the next month. That's when Richard started taking any temporary work he could find. He spent 3 days unloading trucks at a beverage warehouse, 2 days handing out flyers on the street, a week as a construction helper. Hard labor for a 52-year-old man who'd spent his life in an office. By the end of the day, Richard came home aching and crushed in spirit, but at least he brought a few dollars home. Meanwhile, Margaret chased any opportunity she could. She offered to clean houses, do laundry, babysit. She took whatever work came her way, no matter how little it paid. It was a humiliating time for both of them. After 20 years of lower middle-class stability, they were now scrambling for odd jobs just to survive. The worst part of it all was Michael. The child could sense that something was very wrong but didn't understand what. He saw his parents always worried, always tired, always whispering serious conversations that stopped when he got close. "Why? Are you always sad?" he asked one night. "We're not sad, sweetheart," lied Margaret. "We're just busy." "Busy with what?" "Work." But Daddy said there was no work. The child's innocence was both comforting and painful. Michael didn't grasp the severity of the situation, but he felt the tension in the air. It was on a Tuesday at the end of March that things reached a breaking point. Richard came home after another frustrating day of job hunting. He hadn't even landed an interview. He had walked for hours under the scorching sun because he didn't even have money for bus fare. When he got home, he found Margaret crying in the kitchen, clutching a letter in her hands. "What's that?" he asked. "Eviction notice," she replied, without looking up. "What do you mean, eviction?" "The landlord wants the house back. He's giving us 30 days to leave." Richard took the letter and read it. The landlord claimed he needed the house for a relative and was giving them the legal notice to vacate. "But we've always paid rent on time," Richard protested. "Until now. But I think he found out we're unemployed and is afraid we'll skip out on payments." Richard sank into a kitchen chair and buried his head in his hands. 30 days to find a new place. No money for a deposit, no cosigner, no job. It seemed impossible. "What are we going to do?" Margaret asked. "I don't know." It was the first time Richard openly admitted he had no idea how to fix things. His whole life, he'd always had some plan, some hope, some wild solution. Now, for the first time, he was completely out of options. That night, after putting Michael to bed, Richard and Margaret had the hardest conversation of their lives. "We could go to my mom's place," Margaret suggested. "Your mom lives in a 2-bedroom apartment. There's no room for the 3 of us." "It's better than the streets." "For how long? A week? A month?" And then what? I don't know, Richard. I don't know anything anymore. Margaret was at her breaking point. She had always been the strong one in the family, the problem solver, the one who figured things out. But now she felt utterly defeated. I could try asking my brother for a loan, Richard said. Your brother hasn't spoken to you in 5 years. He's family. Maybe he'll help. And if he doesn't, then we're really screwed. The next day, Richard swallowed his pride and called his older brother Robert. They hadn't spoken in years because of a silly argument at a family gathering. Robert, it's Richard. Richard, wow, it's been ages. How are you? I'm going through some tough times. I was wondering if you could help. What kind of tough times? Richard laid out the whole situation, the scam, the unemployment, the eviction. Robert listened in silence. How much do you need? Robert finally asked. About 10 grand for a deposit on a new place and to stay afloat until I find work. 10 grand, Robert repeated. That's a lot of money, Richard. I know, but it's a loan. I'll pay it all back as soon as I get back on my feet. Richard, you're 52. How can I be sure you'll get back on your feet? The question stung worse than a slap in the face, but it was a fair one. How could Robert believe Richard could turn things around when Richard himself didn't believe it? You can't be sure, Richard admitted, but I'm your brother. That's exactly why I can't lend you this money. What do you mean? Because if you can't pay, it'll ruin our relationship once and for all, and I don't want that. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His brother was right, but the rejection hurt like hell. All right, said Richard, trying to maintain his dignity. I understand. Richard, if you want, you can stay here for a few days while you look for a place. Thanks, but that won't be necessary. Richard hung up the phone and sat on the curb. He felt like the biggest failure in the world. Not even his own brother believed in him. When he got home and told Margaret that Robert wouldn't lend them the money, she didn't seem surprised. It was expected, she said simply. It was. Richard, if I were Robert, I wouldn't lend it either. You can't guarantee you'll be able to pay it back. Once again, Margaret was right, and that hurt even more. The following days passed in a blur of desperation and humiliation. Richard and Margaret chased after any possible solution. They tried a bank loan, denied. They tried borrowing from loan sharks. The interest was so high it would be impossible to repay. They tried selling the few valuables they had. It didn't even make $500. With 2 weeks left before they had to leave the house, they still hadn't found a viable alternative. Then something happened that changed everything. Richard was coming home from another frustrating day of job hunting when he noticed unusual activity at the neighbor's house. Several people were coming and going, cars parked out front. Mrs. Eleanor, the 70-year-old neighbor who had lived alone for 15 years, was receiving unexpected visitors. Curious, Richard walked over to the fence separating their yards. Mrs. Eleanor, is everything okay? Can I help with anything? Oh, Richard. The elderly woman approached the fence. I'm so glad you're here. I'm in a very difficult situation. What happened? You know my son Christopher, right? The one who lives in Columbus. I do. Well, he showed up this morning with some papers saying he wants to put me in a nursing home. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He'd heard stories like this before, children taking advantage of their parents' age to seize control of their assets. Do you want to go to a nursing home? Of course not. I'm perfectly fine. I have my quirks. I forget little things sometimes, but I'm fine. And what is Christopher saying? That I can't live alone anymore, that it's dangerous, that I need specialized care. Richard looked at Mrs. Eleanor. True, she'd been a bit more forgetful lately, but nothing that justified forcing her into a home. Mrs. Eleanor, you don't have to go if you don't want to. I know, but Christopher brought some lawyers. They're talking about guardianship. Things I don't really understand. The situation became clear to Richard. Christopher was trying to declare his mother incompetent to take control of her assets. It was a common and often abusive practice. Do you have any other family who can help? I have a daughter, Patricia, but she lives in Miami. I only talk to her on the phone. Why don't you call her? I already did. She said she'd come tomorrow, but I'm afraid it might be too late. Richard suddenly felt compelled to help his neighbor. Maybe it was because he recognized her helplessness. Maybe it was because he needed to feel useful for once. "Mrs. Eleanor, if you'd like, I can stay here until your daughter arrives, to make sure no one forces you to do anything you don't want. You'd do that for me?" "Of course. We've been neighbors for years. It's the least I can do." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "You're an angel, Richard, a true angel." Richard spent the rest of the day at Mrs. Eleanor's house, helping her organize documents and prepare for her daughter's arrival. Christopher and the lawyers showed up 2 more times trying to pressure the elderly woman, but Richard positioned himself as a protective shield. "Who are you?" Christopher asked, annoyed by Richard's presence. "I've been your mother's neighbor for many years, and I can testify that she's perfectly lucid and capable of making her own decisions. This is none of your business. When an elderly person is being pressured, it becomes every decent citizen's business." Richard's firmness even surprised himself. It had been a long time since he'd felt so confident and determined. By late afternoon, Patricia arrived by plane from Miami. She was a woman around 45, resembling her mother, but with a more resolute expression. "Mom!" She hugged Mrs. Eleanor affectionately. "How are you?" "I'm fine, dear, very fine. It's your brother who's trying to put me in a nursing home." Patricia turned to Christopher with a stern face. "Christopher, what's this about?" "Patricia, you haven't seen Mom in months. She's getting senile. Forgets things, mixes up dates, leaves the stove on. Everyone her age forgets some things. That doesn't mean she needs to be institutionalized. She can't live alone." "Says who?" "Says you, who only shows up once a year." The argument between the siblings dragged on into the night. Richard stayed there as a silent witness, ready to step in if needed. In the end, Patricia managed to convince Christopher to drop the guardianship petition, but she proposed an alternative solution. "Mum, how about I hire someone to stay with you during the day? Someone trustworthy who can help with household chores and keep you company." "I don't need it, dear. I manage just fine on my own." "I know you do, Mom, but it would be good to have someone around for emergencies, for conversation, for help with shopping." Mrs. Eleanor thought for a moment. "And where would I find someone trustworthy?" That's when Patricia looked at Richard. "What about you? Would you like to work taking care of my mother?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Me? I saw how you looked after her today. I saw how you treated her with kindness and respect. You're exactly the kind of person I'm looking for." Richard felt his heart race. A job opportunity, after so many weeks of desperate searching. "But I don't have experience caring for the elderly." "You've already shown the most important. Their experience, decency, and compassion. The rest can be learned." "And what would the salary be?" 2,000 Rs a month plus benefits. You'd be here from 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. Richard could hardly believe what he was hearing. 2,000 Rs a month was more than he'd made at his old job, and working close to home, caring for someone he already knew and respected. "I accept," he said without hesitation. "Great. Can we start on Monday?" "We can start tomorrow, if you'd like." When Richard got home and told Margaret about the offer, she couldn't hide her relief. 2,000 Rs, she repeated, as if she couldn't believe it. 2,000 Rs and close to home. I can come home for lunch every day. Thank God. Margaret threw herself into her husband's arms. "I thought we'd end up on the street." "We still have the house issue. The eviction deadline hasn't changed. But with a steady income, it'll be easier to find another place. I can check with real estate agents, offer a guarantor." For the first time in weeks, Richard felt hopeful. It wasn't the life of his dreams, but it was a fresh start, a chance to regain his family's dignity and stability. On Monday, Richard began his new job. He arrived at Mrs. Eleanor's house at 8 sharp, wearing a clean shirt and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. How did you sleep?" "Very well, Richard. And you? How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling useful," he replied with a genuine smile. And it was true. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt useful, needed, valued. The work was easier than he'd imagined. Mrs. Eleanor was truly in good health and sound mind. She just needed companionship and help with some household tasks. Richard accompanied her to doctor's appointments, did grocery shopping, tended to the garden and chatted about life. To his surprise, he found he really enjoyed the work. He loved hearing the elderly woman's stories about the past. He enjoyed caring for the garden plants. He liked the feeling of being useful to someone. Mrs. Eleanor, in turn, quickly grew attached to Richard. She saw in him not just a caregiver, but a friend, a confidant, almost a son. "You know, Richard," she said one afternoon as they had coffee, "in the garden, I've lived alone for so long after my husband passed. It's been ages since I've felt this accompanied. I'm really enjoying it too, Mrs. Eleanor. You're a wonderful employer." "Employer, nothing, we're friends." And they truly were. The relationship between them quickly transcended professionalism and became a genuine friendship. With a steady income, Richard and Margaret managed to find a new home. It was smaller than their last one, and in a slightly farther neighborhood, but it was clean, safe, and within their budget. The move was complicated because they couldn't afford a professional moving company. They did everything themselves with the help of a few neighbors. But in the end, they were settled again, with a roof over their heads and a sense of future. Michael adjusted well to the new house. For a 4-year-old, moving was almost an adventure. All that mattered to him was being with his parents, still loved and cared for. "Daddy, do you like your new job?" he asked one night during dinner. "I like it very much, son, and you know why." "Why?" "Because I'm helping a very special person, and when we help others, we feel good inside." Michael nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood perfectly, even if he didn't fully grasp it. Margaret also found a new job at a private school. It paid a little more than the public school and had a more stable work environment. Life was finally getting back on track. But the scars of what they'd been through were still fresh. Richard carried guilt for what he'd put the family through. Margaret held on to the hurt from the harsh words they'd exchanged during the crisis. They still shared the same bed, the same house, still raised their son together. But there was an emotional distance that hadn't been there before, a coldness they couldn't completely shake. It was Mrs. Eleanor who noticed something wasn't right between them. "Richard, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Mrs. Eleanor." "Are you and Margaret doing all right?" The question caught Richard off guard. He thought about lying, saying everything was fine. But Mrs. Eleanor had a way of inspiring honesty. "To be honest, we're not doing too well. Do you want to talk about it?" "You don't need to worry about my problems. Richard, you take care of me every day. It's only fair that I worry about you too." Richard told her about the crisis they'd been through, the fights, the harsh words they'd exchanged. "You know what I think," she said after listening. "What do you think?" "I think you're both too proud to apologize to each other. But I've apologized to Margaret many times. Apologizing for losing money is easy. What's hard is apologizing for hurting someone's heart." Mrs. Eleanor's observation made Richard think. It was true. He'd apologized for the practical mistakes, the investment, the unemployment, the financial trouble, but he had never apologized for what truly mattered, for making Margaret feel unappreciated, for treating her love as if it weren't enough. "Do you think I should talk to her?" "I think the two of you should talk, with open hearts, no pride, no self-defense, just two people who love each other trying to find their way back to one another." That night, after putting Michael to bed, Richard gathered the courage to have the conversation he'd been putting off for months. "Margaret, can we talk?" "Of course." They sat on the small couch in their new living room. Richard took a deep breath before beginning. "I want to apologize." "Richard, you've already apologized 1,000 times. Not for losing the money. I want to apologize for treating you as if your love wasn't enough for me." Margaret looked up, surprised. That wasn't what she'd expected to hear. "When I said our life wasn't enough, I was talking about me, not you. I was talking about my own insecurities, my own fears of not being enough." "Richard, let me finish," he interrupted. "You spent 20 years of your life supporting me, believing in me, giving me strength. And when I needed you most, I pushed you away. I treated you like an obstacle to my dreams, when in truth you were the only thing that ever gave them meaning." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I need to apologize too," she said, "for calling you mediocre, for saying you could never accept who you really are. But you were right. No, I wasn't. You're not mediocre, Richard. You're a good, hard-working man who loves his family above all else. I was angry and said things I didn't truly mean. The truth is, I am a dreamer, always have been. And maybe that's my flaw. Dreaming isn't a flaw, Richard. The problem is when we let dreams get in the way of reality. Do you think we can start over? I think we already have. When you took the job with Mrs. Eleanor, when I accepted the position at the new school, when we moved into this house. But what about us? Can we go back to how we were before? Margaret was silent for a long moment. We can't go back to how we were because we've changed. But we can be something new, something better. How is that better? More honest with each other, more like true partners, more like real companions. Richard took Margaret's hand and kissed it softly. I love you, he said. I love you, and I love Michael more than any dream, more than any ambition. I love you too, I always have. Even when I was angry, even when I was disappointed. They held each other on the couch in their small home, and for the first time in months Richard felt truly at home, not because of the house itself, but because of the woman in his arms and the child sleeping in the next room. In the months that followed, the family settled into a pleasant, stable routine. Richard loved his work with Mrs. Eleanor. Every day he discovered something new about the elderly woman, heard fascinating stories about the past, and learned valuable life lessons. Margaret also found fulfillment in her new job. The private school had a more stimulating environment, and she felt she was making a difference in the children's lives. Michael grew up happy and healthy. He made new friends in the neighborhood, adjusted to his new school, and developed a cheerful, outgoing personality. For the first time in years, the family's finances were stable. They weren't rich, but they had enough to live comfortably, pay their bills on time, and even enjoy occasional small luxuries. Richard realized he didn't need to be a millionaire to feel fulfilled. He discovered there was a deep satisfaction in caring for someone else, in being useful, in making a difference in someone's life, even if on a small scale. Mrs. Eleanor became part of the family. She visited Richard's home on weekends, was considered an honorary grandmother by Michael, a dear friend by Margaret. You know, Richard, she said one afternoon as they watered the garden plants together, when Patricia suggested you work, here I thought it was just a temporary arrangement. And now? Now I know it was fate. You came into my life when I needed it most, and I came into yours when you needed it most. You're right. Sometimes the bad things that happen lead us to good things. Exactly. If you hadn't lost your last job, you wouldn't be here with me. If I hadn't gone through that problem with Christopher, I'd never have really known you. Richard stopped watering and looked at the elderly woman. Mrs. Eleanor, can I make a confession? Of course. I hadn't felt useful in a long time. I felt like my life had no purpose. But taking care of you, I've discovered that maybe my purpose isn't to be famous or rich. Maybe it's just to make a difference in the lives of the people around me. That's not small, Richard. That's everything. It was true, Richard finally understood he didn't need to conquer the world to have a meaningful life. It was enough to win a few hearts, care for a few people, be a positive presence in his small circle. A year after, starting work with Mrs. Eleanor, Richard received an unexpected offer. Patricia, the elderly woman's daughter, was organizing a small home care business for seniors and wanted Richard to be the coordinator. You have a natural talent for this, she said, and more importantly, you have a calling. I want to build a team of caregivers with the same qualities as you. But I don't have management training. You have something better than training, experience and heart. I can hire someone to handle the technical side. What I need is someone who understands the human aspect of the business. The offer included a better salary and a chance for professional growth. But what mattered most to Richard was the opportunity to multiply the good he was doing. Instead of caring for one person, he could oversee care for dozens. What about Mrs. Eleanor? He asked. She'll still be your direct responsibility, but you'll also supervise other caregivers. Richard accepted the offer. In the following months, he helped build a small business providing home care services for families in the area. He recruited people with qualities like his own, trained a dedicated team, and created protocols for compassionate and efficient care. The business grew quickly, not because it was the cheapest or the most sophisticated, but because it offered something people truly valued: genuine care. "You've become a businessman," Margaret teased one night after Richard shared news of their latest contracts. "I have," he laughed, "but not the kind I dreamed of being." "Better or worse?" "Better, much better, because this business isn't about me. It's about the people we help." Margaret smiled. She had finally found again the man she'd fallen in love with 20 years earlier, not the impulsive dreamer who wanted to conquer the world, but the kind, devoted man who had always been there beneath the grand ambitions. Michael, now 6, no longer remembered the hard times. To him, life had always been good. He had parents who loved each other, a cozy home, a grandma Eleanor who spoiled him, and a father who always came home happy from work. "Daddy, do you like taking care of the old people?" he asked one day. "I really do, son." "Why?" "Because they have so many stories to tell. And because when we take care of someone, we feel happy inside." "When I grow up, can I work with you?" "If you want to, of course, but you can work at anything that makes you happy." "I want to work helping people, just like you." Richard felt his chest swell with pride, not because his son wanted to follow in his footsteps, but because he was raising a child with strong values eager to be useful to the world. 2 years after starting to coordinate the care company, Richard received an award from the Neighborhood Business Association. The small business he had helped build was being recognized as one of the most successful and socially impactful in the area. On the day of the ceremony, Richard stepped onto the stage wearing his best suit, no longer the old grey one, but a new one, bought with honestly earned money. Margaret and Michael were in the audience, clapping. Mrs. Eleanor was there, too proud as if she were his mother. "A few years ago," Richard began in his speech, "I thought success meant winning the lottery, getting rich quick, impressing people with money and flashy things." The audience listened quietly. "I learned the hard way that that kind of success is an illusion. Real success is much simpler and much harder at the same time. It's waking up every day knowing you'll make a difference in someone's life. It's coming home at the end of the day knowing you've been useful." Applause broke out in the crowd. "This company I helped build didn't make me a millionaire, but it made me rich in a way no amount of money could. It made me rich in purpose, in satisfaction, in love." When he finished speaking, Margaret was crying, not from sadness but from pride. The man on stage was the man she had dreamed of marrying when they met over 20 years ago. After the ceremony, the family went to dinner at a simple neighborhood pizzeria. Not because they couldn't afford something fancier, but because that's where they felt happiest. "Dad, are you famous now?" Michael asked. "No, son. I'm known. In our neighborhood by a few people, which is much better than being famous." "Why?" "Because the people who know me know who I really am. They know I take good care of the people I love." Michael nodded, satisfied with the answer. That night, after putting their son to bed, Richard and Margaret stayed talking on their small porch. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked. "Not becoming rich?" "I did become rich," Richard answered. "Rich in family, rich in friendships, rich in purpose." "Seriously, Richard, don't you miss that ambition you used to have?" Richard thought. For a moment. "You know what I realized? All that ambition was actually fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being forgotten, fear of being worthless. And now I know I matter. I matter to you, to Michael, to Mrs. Eleanor, to the seniors our team cares for. I don't need the whole world to validate me. What if a real opportunity to get rich came along, a legitimate one? It would depend on the cost. If the cost was being away from you, losing this work I love, abandoning the people who depend on me, then it wouldn't be worth it." Margaret smiled and rested her head on her husband's shoulder. "I love you," she said. "I love the man you've become. And I love the woman who was always strong enough to stand by me in my worst moments, and wise enough to forgive me when I didn't deserve it." They stayed there on the porch, looking at the stars and thinking about how life can take unexpected turns. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to find the strength to climb back up. The fake lottery ticket, which once seemed like a tragedy, was now seen by Richard as a blessing in disguise. If he had really won 65 million, he might never have discovered his true calling. Perhaps he would never have learned that happiness doesn't come from what we have, but from what we give. Maybe he would never have understood that life's greatest prize wasn't in a lottery ticket, but in his wife's embrace at the end of the day, in his son's smile, or in a heartfelt thank you from an elderly person who felt a little less alone in the world. The next morning, Richard woke up with the same enthusiasm as always to go to work. Not because he had to, but because he had found something many people search for their whole lives and few ever achieve. A job that didn't feel like work, a purpose that gave meaning to his days, a life worth living. As he got dressed for another day at work, he looked in the mirror and saw a fulfilled man. He wasn't the man he had dreamed of being at 20, but he was the man he needed to be at 54. "Good morning, love," said Margaret, walking into the room. "Good morning, my love, ready for another day?" "Always ready when it's by your side." And so began another day in the simple, happy life of Richard Mitchell, a man who once thought he had won the lottery, discovered the ticket was fake, and ended up winning something far more valuable, a life with purpose. The end. Now, tell us what you thought of this journey of overcoming and redemption. Do you believe Richard made the right decisions in the end? What lessons did this story bring to your life? Share your honest reflections in the comments about how to find true success. Thank you so much for following this moving story of new beginnings. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories.